Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today we are going to talk about solving quadratics by completing the square. So you need to make sure that you understand what it is to complete the square. First thing we're going to do is review perfect square trinomials. All right, so let's say that with this first one, I'm going to write it out. So I have x minus 5 squared. Remember, I can't distribute this square because I have a plus or minus inside my parentheses. So you might want to go ahead and write it twice. X minus 5 times x minus 5. So then I get x squared minus 5x minus 5x plus 25 when I distribute that out. Your middle term repeats. So now I have x squared minus 10x plus 25. So we have our perfect square trinomial. Why do we call it a perfect square trinomial? Because it's a binomial squared. With my y plus 7, I'm not going to multiply it out. I'm going to use my pattern that I have here. So I know that I square the first term, y squared. I know that I would multiply y times 7, but it repeats, which means you times it by 2. So plus, and I'm using plus because my sign in front, or my sign in my binomial is plus. So plus 14y. So 2 times 7 times y, because your 7y repeats. Then my last term is always positive, and I get plus 49. So looking at these two, positive perfect square, positive perfect square, positive perfect square, positive perfect square. The sign of my binomial is the sign in front of my middle term. Sign of my binomial is the sign in front of my middle term. And your middle term is repeating or doubling, timesing by 2. All right, so now that we've reviewed what it is to be a perfect square trinomial, because it factors into a binomial squared. All right, so how to make a perfect square trinomial. So this is now we're going to work. So we want to make it a perfect square trinomial so we can write it as a binomial squared. So it says the coefficient of x squared must be 1. This does not work if the coefficient of x squared is not 1. Divide the coefficient of the middle term by 2 and square it. So looking at my this example that I have right here, I have a squared plus 18a. So I'm going to go ahead and say, well, the coefficient in front of my middle term, that's our 18 that we're talking about. And I don't even worry about a sign. So I'm just going to take 18, divide it by 2, and then I'm going to turn around and square it. So 18 divided by 2 is 9. 9 squared is 81. So I made this into a perfect square trinomial so that I can write it as a binomial squared. What's my first term going to be? A. What's my sign going to be? Plus. What did I square to get 81? 9. All right, let's look at this other example. And I'm going to still do another one too. So is my coefficient of my p squared 1? Yes. I'm going to take my coefficient of my middle term, which is 5, divide it by 2, and square it. This one's a fraction, so leave it as a fraction. Square 5, 25, square 2, 4. So I'm going to add 25 divided by 4. The whole reason for me making this into a perfect square trinomial is so that I can write it as a binomial squared. What's my first term? P. What's my sign going to be? Plus. What did I square to get this 25 divided by 4? 5 divided by 2. But let's do another one that's not a fraction. All right, so let's just say, as an example, I had the ones that we have, okay, the ones that we did. All right, so let's say that I have x squared minus 12x. So I have x squared minus 12x. I want to make that into a perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to look at the coefficient of my middle term, 12 divided by 2, 6, and square it. So what am I going to add here? I'm going to add 36. So yes, the sign in front of my 12 is a negative. Can I take a negative 12 and divide it by 2 and get negative 6? Yeah. But then what do you have to do with that negative 6? You have to square it, which negative 6 squared is going to be that positive 36. So it's always a plus. That's why I don't really worry about the sign. The whole point of making that into a perfect square trinomial is so that I can write it as a binomial squared. What's my first term going to be? X. What's my sign going to be? Negative. What did I square to get 36? 6. So that's one of the main things that you're doing when you're solving by completing the square. All right, so let's do a couple of these examples here. All right, solve by completing the square. I'm going to, like the first one isn't in, we're going to solve by completing the square now. Looking at the first example that I have here, it's not in standard form. Well, you don't really want it in standard form anyway, but you want your leading term to be a positive with a coefficient of 1, and then you want to make sure that you also have your x term. Your constant, you want that on the other side. So looking at this example here, we have b squared, it's positive. On the other side of the equal sign, I have 4b plus 9. Well, I want that plus 9 over to stay on that side, but I want this 4b with that b squared. So how do I get that over to the other side? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to subtract 4b from both sides. So now I have b squared minus 4b, leave a space, equals 9. All right, so now my equation looks like this. Now I'm going to divide the middle term, this b divided by a by 2. That's what we're going to do in just a little bit. But here I'm going to say, all right, now I'm going to take my middle term. So this is dividing, this is your middle term by 2. Then square it. So 4 divided by 2 and then squared. So 4. Add to both sides. So I want to make this a perfect square trinomial. So in order for me to make this a perfect square trinomial, taking that middle term, dividing it by 2 and squaring it, I want to add 4. Well, This is an equation. Whatever I do to one side, I have to make sure that I do to the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and write plus 4. So add whatever that quotient is, meaning that I'm squaring it, to both sides. Factor the perfect square trinomial and simplify the other side of the equal sign. So your whole point, remember, for doing this right here, making this into a perfect square trinomial, is so that you can write it as a binomial squared. What's my first term? B. What's my sign? Minus. What did I square to get 4? 2. Equals 13. Square root property. So you're looking at this and you see this right here, you say, oh, I have something squared, right? So I'm going to cover that up, right? That's where my B is. My B is inside there, but I'm going to cover it up and I'm going to say, all right, I want to unsquare it. What do I have to do to unsquare that? That's when I use the square root property. So I do all of this so that then I can say, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Don't forget about your plus and minus. Huge. So then I have b minus 2 equals plus minus the square root of 13. I can't reduce that square root of 13, so I'm just going to leave it just like that. Isolate your b. Get your b by itself. Add 2 to both sides. B then equals 2 plus minus the square root of 13. Can I check my answer? Yes, you can. All right, let's check our answer. B squared. So here's my B. So we're going to use the same B. So let's say I'm going to go ahead and say 2 minus the square root of 13. Right arrow key, close that, and square it. Enter. So I have that. I'm plugging it into my original. Equals 4 times B, open my parentheses, 2 minus the square root of 13, hit my right arrow key, close my parentheses, plus 9, enter. Both sides equal the same value. So I checked my answer and I know that this is my solution. I have 2 solutions here. You'll always get 2 solutions when you're talking about finding the solutions to quadratic equations. You might have to write them both out. So writing them out, I would get 2 minus the square root of 13, 2 plus the square root of 13. Can't see the answer. There you go. Just like that. All right, let's look at B. Once again, I have that y squared by itself. I have a coefficient of 1 on it. I need that 12 on the same side as my y. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add 12y to both sides. So I have 5 is equal to y squared plus 12y. Now, I want to make this into a perfect square trinomial. What do I have to do? Take 12, divide it by 2, and square it. What am I going to add? 36 plus 36. So now I have 41 is equal to, my whole point for doing that is so that I can write it as a binomial squared. Y is the first term. My sign is a plus. What did I square to get 36? 6. Now I want to unsquare it. How can I unsquare it? By taking the square root of both sides. Don't forget about your plus and minus. Square root of 41, I can't reduce that square root of 41, so plus minus the square root of 41 is equal to y plus 6. I need to get that y by itself, so I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides. When you write this answer, you always write it as the plus minus comes last. So -6 minus the square root of 41, and then -6 plus the square root of 41 equals my y. So what I'm saying here is I'm not going to write it as negative square root of 41 minus 6 and square root of 41 minus 6. You always write that the plus minus is the second part of it. All right, so let's do a couple more examples here. All right, let's look at C. So C is in standard form. I don't want it in standard form. I want my constant on the other side. So since I'm going to go ahead and move that constant to the other side, so I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides. So now I have m squared plus 8m, leave a space, equals -12. I need to fill in that space with something. 8 divided by 2, then squared. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. 4 squared is 16. Whatever you do to one side, you do the same thing to the other side. Binomial squared equals 4. M is my first term plus, what did I square? 4. My whole point for doing that is so that I can take the square root of both sides, plus and minus. So I have m plus 4 is equal to plus and minus 2. Subtract 4 from both sides. So I have m is equal to -4 plus minus 2. You need to go ahead and finish this. So m is equal to -6, -4 minus 2, -4 plus 2, -2. So those are my solutions. Go back and look at this. Could I have factored that? Yeah. What factors of 12 add up to 8? 6 and 2. But you can solve by completing the square. Solving by completing the square will work every time also. All right, so let's look at D. First thing I noticed about D is it doesn't have a coefficient of 1. All right, so divide by A, get the leading term of your coefficient 1. That's the first thing that this says that I need to do. So, well, that happens to be the greatest common factor. So when I divide through by 3, you're dividing everything by 3. You're even dividing the other side by 3 because it divides out. So now I have p squared minus 6p plus 10 equals 0. Now I want to move my constant over to the other side. So right here, move the constant over to the other side. So how do I take that 10 and move that 10 to the other side? Yeah, just subtract 10 from both sides. P squared minus 6p, leave a space, equals -10. What are you going to fill that space in with? 6 divided by 2 squared plus 9 plus 9. Your whole point for doing that is so that you can write it as a binomial squared. Simplify that right side, -1. What's my first term? P. What's my sign going to be? Minus. What did I square? 3. Now I have a perfect square equals a -1. I want to unsquare it. How do I unsquare a perfect square? Take the square root of both sides. Don't forget about a plus and a minus. P minus 3 is equal to positive negative I. Add my 3 over to the other side. I have P is equal to 3 minus I, 3 plus I. The more you do it, the easier it gets. And you understand that pattern that you're doing. It's all about patterns. All about patterns. All right, let's look at E. I'm not going to lie, E is not an easy one. First thing I want to do is I want to move that P over to the other side. So I know I'm going to do 5 plus 5P on both sides. So now I have 2P squared plus 5P equals 4. Write that space up, but I don't have a coefficient on my P. So what do I have to do? Divide everything by 2. Ugly, ugly, ugly. So P squared plus 5 halves P equals 2. I need to fill in that space with something. What am I going to fill in that space with? Well, I have 5 halves divided by 2. But I already have a fraction, and I'm dividing by 2. So when you divide by 2, it's really like multiplying by 1/2. So I have 5 halves times 1/2. So I have to do that first. I don't want to put my parentheses there yet. So now I have 5/4. So that's first me taking this middle term and dividing it by 2. Now what do I have to do? Square it. So what am I adding to both sides? I'm adding plus 25/16 and then plus 25/16. Now I'm going ahead and squaring that and writing it so that I see what I'm adding to both sides. The whole thing is when I have a fraction and I'm writing it as my perfect square, I'm writing it as my binomial squared, I do see what I squared. So it's right there. As long as you're writing it out, it's right there for you. So here, I'm going to go ahead and say binomial squared equals, I'm going to have to combine this, so I got to be careful. We're going to do that in just a second. It's very easy to do, especially when we have our calculator. So I'm going to show you how to do that with the calculator. Excuse me. So now here, my first term, what's my first term going to be? P. What's my sign going to be? Plus. What did I square to get that 25/16? It's right here. That's what I was saying. So it's right, as long as you're writing it, it's going to be right there on your paper. So I have 5/4. Now I have to add 2 plus 25/16. You really need to keep that as a fraction. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do this though in my Desmos, which Desmos is really kind of easy like that. Plus, make it into a fraction, 25 divided by, oops, whoops, I didn't mean to do that again. So back out. 25 divided by 16. Okay, so there's my 2 plus 25 divided by 16. Here's my decimal. I do not want a decimal. I just click that and it makes it into that fraction for me. So now I have 57 divided by 16. All right, now I have that perfect square, so I want to unsquare it. So what do I have to do to unsquare that perfect square trinomial? Take the square root of both sides. Don't forget about your plus and minus. So now I have p plus 5/4 is equal to plus minus the square root of 57 divided by the square root of 16 is 4. Now I need to move that over to the other side to solve for my p. So I get p is equal to negative 5/4 plus minus the square root of 57 divided by 4. Not an easy question. Those both have the same denominator, so can I write it as p equals negative 5 plus minus the square root of 57 divided by 4? Sure, you can write it like that too. All right, G says solve by completing the square. Solve by completing the square, that's what these directions are really going to say, really go through. So notice that I'm starting off with my actual quadratic equation in standard form. So I'm going to take a quick picture and I'm going to put it over there. I just don't want to have to keep flipping back and forth. So that's why I'm doing this. And I'm just going to put that picture of those directions right here, just so that we don't have to flip back and forth. But I'm going to put them right here and I make a little bit smaller. All right, so it's in standard form. The first thing I'm going to do is divide everything by a, because technically the coefficient of my x squared, I have a coefficient of my x squared. So I'm going to divide everything by a. So that leaves me with x squared plus b divided by a, x plus c divided by a equals 0. So what I did right there was I just divided everything by a so that my coefficient of my x squared is 1. Now I need to get that c term over to the other side. How do I get that c term over to the other side? Yeah, subtract c divided by a from both sides. So then I have x squared plus b divided by a x equals negative c divided by a. Now I left a space. What do I have to do? I have to, in order to fill in that space, I need to take the coefficient. So I have that b divided by a, divide it by 2, which is the same thing as, we just did it, multiplying by 1/2. So times 1/2. So I get b divided by 2a and square it. So what am I going to add? Plus b squared divided by 4a squared plus b squared divided by 4a squared. I'm squaring that whole fraction. My whole point for adding that there is to make a perfect square trinomial so that I can factor it into a binomial squared. What's my first term? X. What's my sign going to be? Plus. What did I square to get this value? It's right here. B divided by 2a. Now, other side. In order to add fractions, we did it on the calculator, but in order to add fractions together, they have to have the same denominator. My least common denominator here is going to be 4a squared. I have a and 4a squared. So what am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to multiply this denominator. I want it to equal this 4a squared. So what do I have to multiply a by? I have to multiply it by 4a, which means you multiply the numerator by the same thing. So I'm going to rewrite it now for a second. So I have negative 4ac divided by 4a squared. So I think I needed these to have the same denominator so that I can add them together. My least common denominator is going to be 4a squared. What do I have to multiply a by? 4a to get 4a squared, which means you multiply the numerator by the same thing, plus b squared divided by 4a squared. Now, I did that right there, but usually we see it written differently. So we're going to write it as 1. So I still didn't simplify that over there yet. So I'm going to just go ahead and leave this now as x plus b divided by 2a squared equals b squared minus 4ac all divided by 4a squared. So do you see what I did there? I just moved that b squared to the front. Now I want to unsquare it. How can I unsquare it? Yeah, I'm going to take the square root of both sides, plus and minus. Don't forget about your plus and minus. So now I have x plus b divided by 2a is equal to plus minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all divided by, take the square root of the denominator, 2a. Square root of 4a squared, because that's all underneath that square root. So you have to make sure that you take the square root of that denominator so that you don't leave a radical in your denominator. Now I need to get x by itself. In order for me to get x by itself, I need to subtract b divided by 2a from both sides. So then, hopefully this looks a little familiar. X is equal to negative b plus minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. So we just took the standard form of a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and solved it by completing the square to get our quadratic formula, which your quadratic formula is something that you need to know. And it'll be the next section. Well, I hope you guys have a great day. I hope this helps. Good luck on your homework.